Robert, let's switch to the next talk.
Okay, thanks. Let me figure out the share screen thing. I might have you on a different screen, so I'll be looking in a different place than before. But let's see, share screen. So if I do this, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, I'll be looking where I'm looking right now when I'm looking at you, because you're on the side right now. Okay, so let me start by expressing my gratitude to Mark, since there's no better occasion than this. So yeah, though my words carry much less weight than Richard Campbell's, but I too consider Mark to be the greatest philosopher of our time and the kindest person. So yeah, I similarly to Georgi showed up at his doorstep, and the unanticipated openness and friendliness he welcomed me with was just amazing, and it helped me to grow as a researcher and as a person as well. So I'm really grateful for the rest of my life for that. And let me on this note. So this is a comment I found on the internet from one of just anonymous students of Mark. And I believe the last sentence expresses a really good, although unattainable ideal that is nevertheless worth pursuing. So I too want to be Bickert when I grow up, although that might never happen, but I'll be trying.
That's a very carefully selected example, Robert.
I know, but you know,
not all of them were so nice.
I know, but we can ignore them. You know, they don't know. They will, when they grow up, they might realize.
Okay.
By the way, we could make like a T-shirt with it and sell Interactivism merchandise. Would be pretty cool. Okay, so the outline of my presentation. First, I'll just offer some meta comments and point to some problems, although those problems are not with interactivism per se, but with the wider context. And then I'll move on to my work, essentially. So where I have been, but the main question that I started off with was the question of mental attributions and the cultural dependence of them. So like how different people, different communities, different cultures think about minds explicitly in different ways. Like kind of naturally, I turned first to the dominant framework, which is theory of mind framework. And it didn't really make much sense to me, at least it didn't exhaustively answer all the questions that I wanted answered. And that gradually brought me into interactivism, which provided satisfactory answers. So I'm going to talk about some of them in this presentation. Yeah, so that's going to be the case of folk psychology. So that's what we call the practice of thinking about other minds that is commonsensically present in cultures. So I'm going to go through these points. And then I'm going to, although it's not in the title of my talk, I'm going to discuss a little bit emotion that I'm trying to integrate into the account right now, which hopefully could provide some material for discussion and could help me to in further work. Okay. So yeah, so what interactivism offers, and so like I assume that many of us already realize that it is an unparalleled comprehensive ontology of the mind and social phenomena that already contains links between social cognition and other psychological processes. So this is something that theory of mind frameworks and in general psychology lacks, and this has been pointed out multiple times across during the conference, that there's lack of a unifying ontology of what the mind is and how it works that could make different findings in different domains of psychology kind of make sense together. Rather, it is a collection of kind of isolated research questions that do not really chime together. And I believe that to be a problem, although I've noticed that some people, I guess it was Darwin who claimed that there are people who are lumpers and splitters. So I'm definitely a lumper. I want everything to be part of one framework, one unified idea of how things work. But maybe more positivistically minded people are more leaning towards splitting and are more satisfied with it. So yeah, this is normative, the goal of science from my perspective, but if someone disagrees, we can discuss that too. And while presenting the positive framework, Mark has also solved a lot of problems, fundamental theoretical problems with encodingist frameworks, as well as offered improvements in non-encodingist ones. So Piaget, that's, I'm not a specialist on Piaget, but reading Mark, I see that, I assume that he wasn't that clear on many points, and interactivism is actually a kind of step forward from him. And Gibson, this should be clear from reading Mark's book on Gibson, and the disambiguation that it offers is just, to my mind, really great, because when we look at ecological psychology nowadays, it's the numbers of interpretations are really wide, which is not the case with interactivism, but yeah. So where interactivism remains problematic, and this is something we could discuss. So in general, people don't find it easy to grasp the whole thing. And without grasping the whole thing, since it's systematic, it's really difficult to use it. And especially looking at science as a kind of a social endeavor to discover truth, it is a problem, because then we cannot have an empirically minded people just take bits of interactivism and apply it and try to add to our knowledge. So Jed is an exception here. He actually tested hypotheses and produced some knowledge on in this sense, but I believe this to be a problem, a social problem, not a problem of interactivism per se, the framework, but nevertheless. So yeah, the part of it is communicating it, and part of the difficulty of communicating is that in psychology, there's this remnant empiricism and just hostility to metaphysical questions, whereas that's the basis of interactivism. We have the ontological foundation of our theorizing, and that forms this unifying factor that could potentially link different domains of research with each other. So it's not only about getting it, but also being open to and trying to get it, right? And actual study design, again, this is a consequence of this hostility to metaphysics, I believe. But yeah, I think this was brought up in the language panel, right? How we can actually operationalize interactivism in terms of its language model. So that can be also discussed further, and I'll mention some of related comments on that. Okay, so now moving on to the interactivist, the area of theory of mind literature. So that's where I started looking for answers for my question about mental attributions in different cultures. And because this is the dominant study for the social cognition, Jed already talked about it a little, so this is kind of already nicely primed. But let me just mention that there are a few variants in the theoretical debate. There's theory, model or nativism, two-system theory, simulation theory, and those are the biggest. And there is a lot of internal discussion between them. But I believe them to be fundamentally subscribing to the same conception of social cognition. And that is what Spalding termed the claim of broad scope of mind reading. So they might disagree on how it's particularly done, how the process goes on, happens, but they assume, they all assume that social cognition is enabled, made possible, and happens through attributions of mental states, encoded attributions of mental states to others. And that spills over to a lot of other disciplines that use theory of mind research to motivate their claims. So we have a similar thing in linguistics, and I mean, maybe it's not directly related to theory of mind, but the same idea is behind pragmatics in the traditional sense, in which the intention has to be known, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of people who kind of unreflectively draw from theory of mind research and just assume it's okay, whereas it is riddled with problems, as we will see now. So we've already argued in one paper with Mark, in one paper with my supervisor, Arkadiusz Gut, the problems that are inherent in theory of mind. This is largely just taking Mark's criticism of encodingism more generally and pointing out that this is also true for theory of mind models. So first of all, there's the copy problem and the impossibility of internalization. This is especially problematic for within the context of cultural development of cultural nature of social cognition. So in short, the idea, and the copy problem is originally Piaget's point. The idea is that we cannot really step outside of ourselves and know and see what we need to learn to internalize it. So if I need to learn a new cultural concept, culturally specific concept, then I would have to already know it in order to put it in my mind, so to speak. We could talk more about that, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. Foundationalism, this is something that Jed and Mark were more widely criticizing in psychology. So the idea is that if we assume encodings to be the basis of all cognition, then developmentally, the system has to start with foundational concepts, and the development that happens is superficial. It is only a kind of combinatorial consequence, an inference from the basic foundations. So that doesn't really give us a clear way in which, I mean, first of all, it is really counterintuitive. It doesn't seem right that all of our knowledge, like all concepts like email, computer, and so on, that comes from some basic innate foundation. And second of all, it's not really clear how those basic foundational concepts that developmental scientists are proposing could lead to culturally specific concepts that are much more profound and subtle. Okay, frame problems, Muge already talked about that. So this is more epistemic, the idea that if mental attribution was the basis of social cognition, then it would be really problematic for it to actually work, because then what else is relevant for my mental attribution? Like if someone is, it's starting to rain, I can attribute to someone the desire to take out an umbrella and not get wet, and then continue walking. But if that person actually wants to get wet, then they won't take an umbrella out. And such possibilities, contingencies that frame my mental attribution and lead to actual predictions of behavior could go on forever, and it's computationally impossible to actually conduct them. So in short, mental attribution does not exhaust action prediction and does not really explain it. And the coordination problem. So the frame problems are made even worse when we consider an interpersonal situation. The coordination problem just, when we realize that in order to predict someone else's behavior, we have to also have in mind that they are trying to predict my behavior, which also comes into their prediction, and that is an endless circle, a vicious circle. So again, with mental attributions, that would be impossible. And it's really interesting that theory of mind literature completely ignores this, whereas this is a really huge issue for them. I mean, should be at least. So these are fundamental theoretical problems that we can point out that are present in theory of mind framework, and they have resulting methodological problems, methodological in the broad sense. And this has been especially grating to me, that because I wanted theory of mind to work in the cultural context with culturally modulated development. And theory of mind frameworks do not really say anything about links with other sociocultural phenomena, social roles, institutions, culturally specific concepts, emotion, language, character traits. These are all ignored, and if they are actually kind of integrated into the framework, I believe I claim that it is in an ad hoc manner. So, for example, this paper by Westra tries to account for character attribution too within the theory of mind framework, and there he argues that character attribution is kind of like a higher level attribution. So, for example, if we believe that someone is dishonest, we attribute the trait of lack of honesty to someone, then we will attribute the intention to keep a wallet that they found to themselves instead of give it back. And so there is this kind of constraining relationship with the character attribution, character trait attribution, and mental state attribution. A really ingenious idea, but it is problematic because the whole framework doesn't make much sense. And as Jed has argued most strongly here, the whole encoding this framework results in study design and interpretation of results that are overlooking a lot of stuff and are biased to interpret results in a much richer way than we would really want. Jed actually talked about it in his talk that if we have children behaving in accordance with laws of physics, in accordance with a lot of what we could call knowledge, and therefore we could assume that children are representing those domains in full like we are, and therefore we end up with infants who are skilled biologists, physicists, and all that, which seems implausible to say the least. Okay, so in our paper, in the paper I wanted to stress two things essentially. So first, I wanted to make the broad consequences of the model explicit, and we touched upon social ontology and the place of the person in it, the concept of situation convention and its centrality for the study of sociocognitive development, the model of language as a manipulator of situation conventions, and the constructivism of sociocognitive development and the role of scaffolding. So we covered all of that. Obviously, I can't really talk about all of it here, but the paper is mostly based off of Mark's book from 1980, and this book I believe to be really brilliant, although probably the hardest of Mark's, infamous for that, but it has the level of detail that I believe could be used to, when I was talking specifically about language, to generate hypotheses and to really do something empirical with it. We could read it next in our reading group, potentially. Okay, and then I wanted in this paper to address the points of concern that theory of mind dominated research has been, the points of concern for that area, and that is false belief task, folk psychology, and culturation. They are, theory of mind is kind of moving towards testing to researching culture and theory of mind, although that has its own problems, and I will point some of them out. And also we talk about language, as this is also an issue in theory of mind literature. Okay, so I will talk about the folk psychology specifically, and I'll see how I stand with time, and then I can talk about other stuff as well. But this, I believe, this is the central issue that satisfies my initial questions of mental attribution and cultural modulation of that. So, so the basic question I believe here is, what is the relationship between processes that are basic to social cognition and the ideas about the mind that cultures have developed? So there's folk psychologists, folk psychologies. Theory of mind models do not really make it clear what the relationship between the two is. And this is one of the really annoying things about it. So for nativist models, there is a clear ontological gap. They don't have answers. I mean, they posit that there's that theory of mind is a module that is like a miniature version of folk psychology, but there's no clear model of how that relates to explicit thinking about other minds, and that is kind of left unexplained. They just don't talk about it. For theory, which is this, they call it rational constructivism, there's the blurring of the difference. So I think what they assume, although I mean, if someone has a direct quotation from Wellman or Gopnik, who are the main proponents of it, that states it, that it would be great to hear it. But it seems to me that they are assuming that that thinking in terms of theory of mind is first implicit, that is in this sense unconscious, and then it becomes with development increasingly explicit. So it's just a kind of continuous process that is, and there's no differentiation between the two. So yeah, in short, there's just a clear gap between the explanations of the two that really bothered me when I was reading this stuff in the first place. And that's part of the appeal that I found in interactivism, that it actually allowed me to see the difference, to model the difference. So yeah, the consequences of this, that there is no clear distinction between the two, is that the cross-cultural research within theory of mind does not really address really culturally interesting questions like culturally specific concepts, the acquisition and understanding of norms, rituals, traditions, stuff like that. It's just absent. But it should link with theory of mind if it really does what the researchers are claiming it is doing. That is, it is the base of all social cognition. So if that is not clear, then I see it as really explanatorily weak. So it doesn't really start to address those questions. Yeah, I said that. Yeah, I mean, and how cross-cultural research within theory of mind end up being is essentially just testing for correlations between theory of mind reasoning, using the basic terms that they term to be foundational, beliefs and desires, and some closely related concepts. And how that correlates with really broad cultural variables like collectivism, individualism, authoritarian, authoritative parenting styles, and so on. So they're finding a correlations or lack of correlation there, but it is, first of all, also not clear what collectivism and individualism is and how that exists, what the basis of I mean, what is the mechanism, if you want to use that vocabulary, between the interaction between collectivist property of a culture and the developmental process of the child. So those are just correlations, no explanations. Okay, so now moving on to the case of folk psychology within interactivism that actually makes sense of all of this. The basic claim is that basic social cognition is constituted by level 1 knowledge of situation convention. So this is implicit, and there's been a lot of talk already at this conference about it, so I don't have to really recap it. But the idea is that children learn how to interact first, and they don't have explicit knowledge about those interactions. And on this point I read recently Catherine Nelson's book on event representation, which could potentially inform thinking on this, because they did actually conduct studies, empirical studies that asked for how children see different situations, cultural situations, like they call them scripts, I think, and how like a script in a restaurant is structured, how a script of a birthday party structures, and so on. So they asked about like sequencing of events. So for example, in a restaurant, you have a clear sequence. First you order, then you pay, and so on. Whereas at a birthday party, it's not really that structured, right? Like you can unwrap presents at the beginning, also at the end. It's kind of open, and children seem to. I mean, and it's interesting to study that first, right? Like this is something that is not studied by theory of mind literature, because they presuppose that mental attributions come first and such knowledge of events later. Whereas with action-based models, this is the reverse. Such action-based event representations should be is the basis from which explicit understanding of the mind is abstracted. But about that, we'll talk now. Yeah, so this general idea of basic social cognition just being action prediction, roughly, is in line with other accounts. So procedural social knowledge does not require mental state attribution. That is a miniature version of folk psychological reasoning. And activists claim similar thing. Marco Fanici kind of not committing to any particular framework, but he is largely claiming the generally same thing. And Hatto also in a different branch of Interactivism, and many more, I would say. And as we had the opportunity to listen to the discussion on language, and this connects with language in obvious ways. So I believe both Ruth Kempson and Eleni Gregora Michalaki and Joanna Ronczacek-Lonardi presuppose an action-based model of representation of social cognition, right? So there's the mental attribution is not necessary to language, and by the same token, it's not necessary for acting in competent ways in social situations, even before language comes into, if there is even such a point. Okay, so the claim that interactivism helps us. I mean, the way that interactivism allows us to think about folk psychology, I believe, opens up a lot of doors for studying cross-cultural aspects of social cognition. So in the text, we were claiming that folk psychology is a reflective convention. So this is already level 2 knowing. And that a reflective convention is a kind of collective cultural way of abstracting certain properties of knowledge implicit in cultural action schemes, so to speak, so at level 1. And then once we do it, we can use it in various ways, in the ways that generally reflective thought is used. So this is consistent. This is consistent with much of what pluralist theory of folk psychology has argued for. This has been a recent kind of strand of discussion, which essentially what those philosophers have pointed out is that, like we are not using mental attribution, folk psychology, only to predict behavior of others. And in fact, we rarely do that. Rather, we use it to explain behavior, to excuse our behavior, to offer explanations, and so on. So this is closer to what Brandon was talking about in his idea of like reason-giving practices, and folk psychology comes into that. So there's this whole social dynamics that makes use of mental concepts that is way much more diverse than what theory of mind theoreticians would want. But of course, this is already at the explicit level of thinking. So a common rebuttal of this would be by theory of mind theoretician would be to say that, yeah, you're talking about folk psychology, we are talking about modules at the unconscious level. But yeah, but it doesn't change the fact that theory of mind does not really offer much in terms of explanation of these phenomena, of these social dynamics that involve mental attributions at the explicit level. Okay. So going further into this, I would claim that some of the properties abstracted by a given folk psychology are characteristic of knowing in general, but some of them are characteristic of the conventional organization of the mind in the particular culture. So this, essentially the idea is that those level 1 knowing instantiates properties that are generally necessary for knowing. So belief and desire concept kind of capture that. They abstract that property. Belief is generally just the intentional and the assertive, asserting a relationship to some content. So all knowing, all anticipation is sort of that. We could talk, and actually cognitive science is doing that, talk about knowing in terms of asserting propositions. And I believe folk psychology is approximately the same thing in many cultures, in most cultures actually. Wierzbiska found the concept of belief to be culturally universal, or at least near universal. and the same for desire. So desire captures the tendency, the anticipatory nature of cognition. So we are, normativity permeates knowing inherently, and desire, I believe, is a folk psychological way of thinking about that. And that the universality of those properties of knowing, I believe, is what makes those concepts really useful for abstracting and therefore including into folk psychology of cultures. And that's why we find them across cultures, because it's just commonsensically really useful to know to talk about beliefs of some other person. And it becomes helpful and becomes helpful in many contexts, social situations. We can, as I said, explain behavior, predict, excuse, and so on with the use of those concepts. But interactivism offers, within this context, also a possibility that in the same way that the concepts of belief and desire are abstracted, we can also abstract properties of minds that are only specific to that to the organization of the mind that grows in a particular culture. So the idea of enculturation, maybe I should have talked about that a little bit more, but the idea is that when you are developing in culture, when you are learning about the different ways of relating to one another, particular ritual, particular scripts, cultural scripts, and so on, then your mind just instantiates the anticipatory structure that essentially co-constitutes that cultural way of behaving, cultural way of relating to one another. And that doesn't have to, and those properties don't have to be universal. They are not like belief and desire. They can be culturally specific. And for example, the Chinese face seems to be like that. The Welsh Hyreth, I believe that's how you pronounce it. Those are concepts that seem to be capturing ways of social interaction that is inherent only in those particular cultures that emerged across years. And those people from those cultures found it really useful to abstract them too, because they have been the part of their sociocultural environment, and therefore it was really useful to also have them explicitly represented. But what I think is really important here is that adopting the interactivist framework, we can make sense of what those concepts are, and they are not mysterious and not kind of addressable anymore like they are in the theory of mind research. And a similar thing applies to many near universal folk psychological concepts, such as permitting, disappointing, denial, and so on. All those concepts are also ignored by theory of mind research for the same reasons that they just don't have resources to account for them. But they nevertheless form a core of most folk psychologies, right? We talk about people being refused to do something, being disappointed in someone, and that presupposes already a sociocultural structure, sociocultural reality that makes it possible to permit someone to do something, right? That cannot be innate because that emerged with cultures. Yeah, and interactivism can help us with that too. So yeah, conclusion about this is that interactivism offers a much more comprehensive framework for studying the cultural nature of folk psychological reasoning and its development than theory of mind framework. Well, the question of how exactly to study those concepts, to study the acquisition of culturally specific concepts and so on, that remains to be worked out because, like empirical scientists don't really work with interactivism widely, and so the details remain to be worked out. But I believe this is already a great ontological foundation for doing so. And Mark's book from 1980 gives a lot of detailed analyses that could be used to offer particular studies. How much time do I have?
10 minutes left.
10 minutes, okay. All right, so I'll just quickly go through emotion, and maybe we can discuss that because this is actually what I was most interested in discussing. So what I want to do is I want to incorporate emotion into the account. And I believe emotion has been just kind of glossed over by most accounts, even by action-based and activists and all that, because they just assume affect is kind of always present and so on. But it really bothers me because it does not really explain much. Like emotion is clearly different from thinking. It's clearly different from like action-based implicit knowledge of situations. And just saying that it permeates our forms of life and so on does not really explain much. So the recap of interactivist motion is that, as Jed already talked, I think, level 1 anticipations do not represent, that is, form anticipations about their own properties, such as stability or certainty. Yeah, this is the same thing depending on whether you approach them ontologically or epistemically. So it interacts with the environment only. So what emotion does, what is argued to do, is that it allows level 1 anticipations to interact with their own uncertainty. So the information about uncertainty is already present in basic learning. So the destabilization and stabilization of microgenesis in random variation and selection is based on that aspect, on that information. So it's already present in the system, in its organization. What emotion does is just turning that information into a feature that is interactable by level 1 knowing. So it becomes possible for the system to interact with its own uncertainty. And that allows the organism to represent situations on the basis of uncertainty. So Mark's example is this situation involving a big animal. Instead of just generating random sequences of action and testing if they are supported by the environment, you can have a general heuristic of running away. And that's what emotion allows. And this gives us different emotions according to the interactivist model. So uncertainty in a situation, for example, involving other person obstructing a goal would be a different emotion than one involving a big animal. So this would be, big animal thing would be fear, whereas involving other person obstructing a goal would be anger. I mean, these are just general examples that are designed to give you just the general idea. Okay, so most of my time now is spent on reading the emotional literature, which is big and encodingist mostly, and it's tiring, but I consider it necessary. But what they, I think, pick up on is correct as an explanandum. So things that need to be explained. So emotions have motivational, cognitive, intentional, evaluative, and phenomenal aspects. And it's so interesting to think about them within the interactivist framework, because interactivism accounts for all of them. Not specifically the emotion submodel, but the interactivist framework as a whole has explanation why emotions are like that, right? So motivational, it's anticipatory, therefore it's always motivational. All-knowing is cognitive, intentional, because it's anticipation of a particular flow of interaction in a particular event. The difference is that with emotion, it's kind of this partial meta representation. Evaluative, that's also inherent in the interactivist framework because all cognition is normative in reference to the organism. And phenomenal, the system, this has been taken up by Itai. Generally, interactivism does offer a model that is consistent with our phenomenal experiences to a great extent, and that is already a lot, although we can debate the qualia thing, right? And I believe that the functional difference that the emotion model offers also chimes with the phenomenal difference that we feel about emotions. So emotions feel differently than experiencing sensory immediate interaction, and it feels different than thinking reflectively about stuff. Okay, so maybe I should skip over that. So the idea I want to propose here is that we have basic emotions. This is a big thing in emotional literature. Panksepp was the main, I mean, is the, I believe, most interesting researcher here. So the idea is that emotions are those action. This is really close to interactivism because he claims that emotions are those, he claims, innate action strategies, action behavioral heuristics that kind of generalize over common challenges in the life of organism. Yeah, so he actually stimulated particular areas in the brain and saw that then the animal behaves in particular really systematic ways. And he identified, all in all, I think 7 basic emotions. So for example, expectancy emotion evokes foraging, exploratory behavior, and in natural circumstances, it is argued to activate when corresponding homeostatic imbalances obtain. So this is consistent with interactivism, with the difference that instead of just being an innate action program, innate action programs, this will be the kind of innate constraints onto the further development differentiation of emotions. So we can start with them, but then through random variation and selection, the organism can further differentiate and learn new emotions. So yeah, I mean, one way of thinking about it is that a major initial basic emotional response in humans seems to be crying. So the child cries as a response to anticipatory uncertainty. Given the highly social nature of humans, figuring out what the cause of uncertainty is offloaded onto caregivers generally. So guidebooks for parents, I'm not a parent myself, but I looked at some of those guidebooks and I listened to my sister who has kids. They mention all kinds of methods of identifying what is the reason. And there's just a few things that you have to tick off. Like, has she eaten? Is she comfortable? And so on. And if you kind of tick all of them off, then the child kind of wants to cry and you have to leave her. But the point is that if crying is this emotion-based innate heuristic for interacting with anticipatory uncertainty, in humans it is clearly really social already. Yeah, so the child can, with time, learn to modify the crying behavior to cue the caregiver as to what the crying is about. And I believe parents do develop this kind of intuitive knowledge of okay, this type of crying, that's hunger, and so on. And that can be done. That can develop through variation and selection, and it doesn't like assume any prescience on the side of the child. So, and this would, if that's true, then this effectively gives us the child's gradual differentiation of emotion-based, uncertainty-based representation, and initial emergence of different emotions. And as I said, it makes human emotions deeply social at the very outset. So kind of, if that's true, then emotions will be the first kind of domain area within which communicative acts emerge. So when the child becomes more independent, she can address the basic uncertainties herself. So you can, like the child can get the food herself. She doesn't have to cry for food to get the parents to bring some food. And this would require the relearning of how emotions should be dealt with, and I believe would be part of emotional development in general, right? However, there's no reason why the caregiver cannot continue to be used as a resource. Yeah, so the child can still use it, can react to the anticipatory uncertainty in a way that has the parent come and help deal with the uncertain situation. So I pulled some stock pictures off the internet to make a narrative. So I can imagine that 2 children are playing, and then the one child becomes, rude, which makes the other child fail at anticipation, because the assumption was that we are just gonna continue playing nicely. This can cause crying or some kind of emotional behavior, which can then be noticed by the parent, who can come and impose some structure, interactive structure onto the child, or explain the behavior to the child. But explaining would already presuppose that there is reflection available, that the child can kind of interact with her own mind. But the interactivist model allows such situations to be really educational, because then the child is it is possible for the child to retain those heuristics imposed by the parent as those differentiated emotions, as those new ways of dealing with emotions, and therefore would be really helpful, and therefore it would be essential for parents to be really careful for giving the right ways of solving emotional situations, solving uncertainty, so that the child can handle her emotions properly, and this could potentially explain all kinds of social anxiety issues and so on. So yeah, this is really initial idea. As I said, I've been mostly just reading the literature to have the general outlook, but it's interesting. It would be interesting to discuss this. Okay, so yeah, as I said, interactivism offers a comprehensive framework for studying social cognition, its development, and the whole person. I discussed a little bit of folk psychology and emotion, and the need for operationalization remains open. But I would claim that this initial general idea about emotion already offers some intuition about an experiment. Yeah, we could measure how parents react to their children's emotional episodes, and then correlate it with some understanding, social understanding, which potentially could turn out to be significant, and therefore would support the model, the proposal. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Any questions, comments? Eleni, go ahead, please.
Hello. Thank you very much, Robert. That was great. It was a great talk, and obviously I agree with everything that you said, except when it came to emotion. When I saw that you were referring to some kind of theory of basic emotions, which is kind of discredited in my view nowadays. So if you look at, for example, Linda Feldman Barrett, you will see that there are all these theories that presume that emotions are social constructions. So these basic kinds of emotions are not to be found in every culture. They are not located in the brain. What you have in the brain or internally are some kinds of feelings that can be then culturally developed into these various different categories of emotion. And there are no basic emotions in the sense of Panksepp or Ekman or whoever. And then if you take that kind of perspective, then one other reference that you could look into, which is rather old though, would be to look at somebody called Nico Frija, who had exactly this particular theory of why emotions, both positive and negative, are states of action readiness. And this is how you can conceptualize emotions as being sources of anticipation of what is coming up, and states of disequilibrium or equilibrium and all that. So that was my kind of comment.
Yeah, thanks. I have those people on my reading list. I mean, the answer to your concern is that, like, I don't take basic emotion theory to be, I don't just buy it wholesale. I don't buy the assumptions of the innateness of that. The point here is that to take that into and explicate it within interactivism as kind of innate, meaning not requiring experience, roughly, constraints that kind of predispose the child to already have some anticipatory reactions to uncertainty, right? So crying, for example, does not really require the child to learn. It is kind of the outset, which obviously cannot be presupposed that it's to be explained how the physiological constraints and all that happens, that the child does have this anticipatory reaction to uncertainty. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I would say that from there, it is all about differentiating within those domains that are constrained by those basic, those non-cultural, non-experiential factors.
Right. There's a difference between feelings, which is what you're saying, and emotions, which are conceptual categories that are culturally constructed. That's Feldman Barrett's proposal with respect to emotions. But yeah, okay. Then
yeah, that would be, yeah, we could argue, but that's about this semantic stipulation. Yeah.
Jet, then Mark.
thanks, Robert, for interesting stuff as usual. I see you keep developing the ideas too from the different talks I've heard. The first one is just a quick question. Is your idea about emotions and how parents respond and then children can develop the heuristics for themselves, would that be a mechanism for understanding like the internalization or the socialization of behavior from parents?
Part of it, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the end of the whole story, right? But clearly it would play a really crucial role because the first, if my intuitions they're kind of mostly intuitions still are correct, then those are the first domains of communicative acts, right? Like the child is the first differentiations of trying to specify why am I crying is within the emotion context, uncertainty context. Yeah? And if that is true, then the child will learn to, with time, differentiate them with in such ways that the parents react to, right? So the parents already come with some cultural, their minds already formed, and they will react to different cues, and therefore will impose selection pressures onto the child's differentiation there. So yeah.
Okay, I'll say my other question since there's actually many hands up. It's about belief and the development of belief across cultures, but I'll wait for it.
Yeah, thanks.
Mark?
Okay, a couple of comments. I'm the one who's guilty of focusing on Panksepp here. And so I'd like to respond to Ellen. And basically, I agree completely. The reason that I like Panksepp is because he gives a very powerful, future-oriented, anticipatory, strategic, interactive framework for thinking about emotions. He's not the only one that does so. But I completely agree that the whole idea of innate basic emotions has serious problems. Some sort of a fundamental metaphysical split between basic emotions and higher order or social emotions, I think, is basically wrong. It's both conceptually wrong as well as empirically wrong. So I fundamentally agree with you about what you were saying, including the criticisms of Panksepp. But he does introduce, and again, he's not the only one, this future-oriented conception of emotion that is very closely connected to his own work in neurophysiology. You're right that people have talked about socially constructed emotions. One of the earliest ones I know of is Ram Hare, I think back in the 70s. I'm not sure when it was, coming from a Wittgensteinian framework, talking about social emotions. And, that's always made perfectly good sense to me. So that's what I've wanted to try to account for. So empirically, one of the earliest, quote, emotions, unquote, is just arousal. And then arousal differentiates into positive, negative, negative differentiates into fear and anger. And eventually those differentiations become more and more culturally specific. And that would violate Panksepp's model right there, just that very fact. But that seems to be the empirical case. But it also fits with a future-oriented conception and with a ultimately socially constructed kind of conception. Although, the basic ones, I don't know if I'd call them socially constructed. They're sort of constructed. They're sort of evolutionarily constructed. I mean, there's some basic orientations to the world that make evolutionary sense, like running or getting angry and attacking, or vomiting to get rid of stuff. There's some basic orientations to when uncertainties are encountered and not really very easily resolvable that make perfectly good sense here. Two other brief points. One is I would urge Robert to avoid the word operationalize.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking about that.
Yes, I mean, what you're meaning there, I take it, is test.
Yeah, the test the consequences.
Yeah, right. Well, operationalize, I've argued, doesn't even exist. Another broad comment is about belief. I have one very short publication somewhere called Why Believe in Belief. And it sort of illustrates my own double take on this. I don't think beliefs in any of the standard models actually exist at all, because the standard models are some more sophisticated version of a propositional encoding in a belief box. And neither one of those is real. Neither one of those can be real. So if that's what the term belief is taken to refer to, it's, you know, it's referring to an empty set. There's nothing there. I do think more can be said about the use of the term belief. One side of it is that what people care about when they talk about beliefs are characterizations of aspects of presuppositional realms. So if I say you believe X, what I'm claiming is, and the claim there is itself important, but I'll get to that in a second. I'm claiming that you are disposed to function in the world, to interact with the world in a way that presupposes X. You may presuppose a whole lot of other things, and X may only be a partial characterization. So if I say the chick in that earlier example of the bird species presupposes that pecking at red spots yields food or something like that. Well, that's part of it, but that's not all of it, because it's implicit and so on and so on and so on. So belief, I think, is in a referential sense trying to pick out characteristics, characterizations, properties of implicit presuppositions. The other side of it is that if I say John thinks that the moon is made of green cheese, suppose what I'm saying is true. John believes the moon is made of green cheese, but John may have never had that thought in his life. So what could I possibly mean? Well, in making the claim in language, I'm somewhat parallel to Branham here. I'm setting myself up to having defend what I've said if John functions in such a way that does not presuppose the moon is made of green cheese, that somehow violates that assumption. So I'm making a social commitment. Now, moon being made of green cheese is not a terribly common social commitment. But suppose I say John believes that women are hostile. Suppose I'm John's therapist and I say, John, you seem to believe that women are hostile. And John says, oh, that's weird. I've never had that thought in my life. But nevertheless, I say, well, look at all the stories you've told me about the way you interact with women. And it certainly looks like you believe. And John may say, oh, well, yeah, it sort of looks like you're right. So beliefs don't have to be explicit at all. They can be implicit and they can be extremely broad. They don't have to be singular, as in the case of John believes that women are hostile. But notice, again, I'm making a social commitment. I'm committing to John if I tell John, it looks like you believe women are hostile, to explain myself if he says, well, what about this or what about that? Or what do you mean? I've never had that thought in my life. Unfortunately, the standard response to what do you mean? I've never had that thought in my life. The standard response would be, oh, well, you have, it's just unconscious. And the whole notion of the dynamic unconscious is an invention to try to account for explicit beliefs that are not explicitly conscious. But implicitness is an entirely different realm for trying to understand that. Okay, I could say a whole lot more, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I take it to be just elaboration, probably better terms of what I was trying to say. Because yeah, like we use belief, right? Like we use the terms of belief in our everyday life. So it doesn't make sense to say that that doesn't work, right? Like the beliefs work, but they work in the way that Mark was talking about right now, that they regulate our social commitments and they capture the properties, the aspects of interacting socially, right? And they are useful in that sense, but they are not it is not true that they refer to some states in a black box. So yeah, I mean, this differentiation, just maybe I should stress that more, right? That I'm talking about the social concept, not the philosophical concept that kind of went too far with it.
Joanna?
Yes, thanks, Rob. Very nice talk. And I really think that the theory of mind problematics, let's say, or domain is an excellent entry point to actually show to the, let's say, mainstream the potentialities of interactivism, because it's very concrete in a sense, and I think we can do a lot there. The same about folk psychology. And my question is, you said, sorry if I make some mistakes with terminology, I'm not yet used to use it, but you said that in making those sort of second level knowledge abstraction, there is this kind of stage that we build some generalizations, or like folk psychology, etc. And they can be culturally dependent, because they depend on how we interact with the social environment. And I just was wondering how important language is here, being there as a system of of controlling of those interactions. And if you think that, I mean, what is language very, I mean, because of course language is important there, right? But how important do you see this? If there is anything beyond language that has this potential also. And just before you answer, a very quick comment about the emotion discussion, which I find very, very interesting. And I'm siding here, I think, with Eleni, that I think we are missing a very, very potent possibility that it is, and maybe Mark is not missing it, probably he's not, and I haven't seen it yet in his papers, but that own state of disequilibrium is a very potent source of possible self-regulatory emotions, and displays of emotions can be seen as cry for social help, which probably your example of crying was a good one here. Okay, thanks.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, that I didn't talk about language, but naturally it's well, if not it is the most significant aspect of it, because essentially, if we take language to be the manipulator of social situations, right, then social situations are constituted by anticipations of possible linguistic manipulations, right? So therefore, even aspects of situation conventions that are not, per se linguistic, so for an object, for example, if we can talk about the object, right, like then it functionally anticipatorily links with interactions in social situations, talking about it, giving it to someone, referring to it, and so on. So with language, it all kind of is interwoven together into an anticipatory structure, the convention, that we can coordinate our actions within. So language, in that sense, structures and scaffolds reflection, because the reflection already is over anticipatory structures that are largely formed with language. So it's not only objects that we talk about. It's not only, the child does not reflect only on the object, I would say. It also reflects on the object as it fits into social reality. And therefore, using words to refer to particular elements of object can help the child to think about them explicitly, because the anticipatory structures involved in linguistic interactions with other people and the object together already kind of highlight the separatedness of that aspect of the object, right? So in different cultures we have, well, the child can be essentially scaffolded with language to think about different things quicker, like to develop explicit thoughts about different domains in reality faster. So that's the general thrust I would give it.
And beyond language?
What do you mean beyond language?
I mean, because of course, once you see how language is important, then you fall into this trap. I think also it's a trap of thinking that language mostly does this, and mostly language does this, and other things are not so important, such as, I don't know, routines, for example, customs, habits, rituals, stuff like that. If you will, are they of the same level, or maybe they form this level 1? I don't know. I don't move very well here.
I mean, the rituals, the social situations, and so on. This is what is being manipulated by language. So this is like it's not really differentiated in the sense that language is. I mean, in order to realize that language is different from social situations, that requires explicit reflection, right? Because then you can say, okay, this is the aspect of situation that the vocalizations of certain sorts, for example, gestures, are manipulating, whereas there are other aspects of social situations that rely only, for example, on nonverbal interaction. So it is functionally interwoven, but explicitly can be analyzed into different categories. And I think we do that, and that might be part of why there's this bias for thinking about language as a separate system, because we've already done that as a culture. We've separated the linguistic domain of social situations from language, from social reality, and kind of wanted to study only that, and forgot about this close relationship with social reality more generally.
Okay, before moving on, we should try to wrap it up in 7 minutes so that we can have 30 minutes for dinner or lunch. Richard and then Jorge.
A couple of what I think are small points. It seemed as if you were taking a reaction to uncertainty as a kind of catch-all within which to start to differentiate emotions. And I'm wondering whether there is a single route, as it were, to emotions, anything like that. That's the first issue. And the second one is quite small. It seems to me the crying isn't just only a reaction to uncertainty of anticipations. A child will cry if it's in pain. Whether the child's being in pain, you might not want to call it an emotion. I'm not sure, but it's certainly a very expressive act.
Okay, so as for the first question, I'd say that it's part of the situation, that the kind of emotional feedback and the information about anticipatory uncertainty, but the whole point that different emotions are differentiated comes from seeing that as part of the whole representation of the situation. So it's not only anticipation based on the uncertainty feedback, it's also based on the particular situation that is represented, that is not based on interaction with uncertainty, but is based on interaction with the world. So again, anticipatory uncertainty in the context of a big animal gives us a different emotion than in a social context of, I don't know, embarrassing oneself. In virtue of those other aspects of situation representation. I'm not sure if that fully addresses your concern, but and the second thing, could you remind me what was the second thing?
Oh, a child will cry if it's in pain.
Oh,
and I don't see that as a reaction to uncertainty.
I mean, that was on Mark's view. I think it would be, although Mark can correct me here, that pain is this the state that is impossible to be interacted with successfully. So a anticipatory trajectory that gets activated that ends with pain is automatically selected against, and that would be part of emotions in the broad sense, if I'm correct. Mark, could you
Yeah.
comment on that?
Yeah, pain is a complicated example, and because pain is actually an extremely complex phenomenon. So you have reflex responses to pain. You have learning responses to pain. You have emotional responses to pain, and so on and so on. Now, not all animals are capable of having emotional responses to pain. But for those who do, the emotional responses can be quite important. So for example, hypnotic pain reduction in humans does not really eliminate the pain sensations. What it does is to reduce the emotional responses to those pain sensations. I mean, I can go on, but the point is that, yeah, I would claim that the infant is responding to an emotional response to the pain, or is responding within an emotional response to the pain. And as Robert said, one of the definitions of pain that are functional definitions of pain that I think works, it's not the firing of C fibers, as is so often talked about in the literature. It's rather certain sorts of form of interactive reception that are designed to not be directly interactable with. And so things that yield pain are things that automatically fail with respect to the anticipations that might be involved. That can get overridden once you've got consciousness, reflective consciousness. And reflective consciousness, so far as I know, is what's involved in things like hypnotic reduction of pain. So, I mean, I can keep going because, in fact, it turns out to be an extremely complicated phenomenon. But Robert is right. I would claim that in humans, responses to pain are emotion-laden.
Okay, Jorge?
Yes, regarding emotion, what is your outlook on the phenomenon of emotional anesthesia, which seems to be quite a hindrance in problems, in creative problem solving or mathematical problem solving, and maybe it deserves some sort of microphenomenological investigation?
I haven't encountered the term, but I just take it to be that the emotion is kind of tuned down in such cases. So that could be the case. I mean, when we look at the human brain, it seems that we have areas functionally specialized. I mean that we have physical specialization for the function of emotion within the brain in certain areas, right? So so if we damage that, those parts, then the whole dynamic that is based on the uncertainty feedback would potentially get crippled. So that would be the answer here. And then if thinking relies on this, a certain kind of thinking relies on emotion being the case, I mean, doing its work, then that thinking will also be pathological, be in problem, run into problems. I'm not sure if I got answered satisfactorily.
I mean, it's quite a recurrent phenomenon. I mean, in healthy students. So not so much what could be pathological. So that emotions, so for instance, negative emotions are not acknowledged. And if you begin to probe a bit, sometimes they come out to the surface, especially in the context of mathematical problem solving, because many students sort of think that they are not supposed to like or dislike, they are supposed to understand and solve.
Well, one way of dealing with that off the top of my head would be to claim that the emotional, what constitutes emotions is level one, and not made explicit emotions. So the anticipatory uncertainty, the negative emotion, is at the level that is not reflected on, and such a person will just get anxious but not really realize why they're anxious, or not even notice explicitly that they are anxious or fearful, whatever would call it, because that would be it would be constituted by the organization of the mind, but it would not be interacted with at the reflective level. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have 30 minutes till next talk. So should we officially end, but for those who want to stay can continue? Is that okay? You are muted, or can you hear me?
Well, it's fine with me, but yeah, like I think we want to make it clear that people can get food. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start the final two talks in 29 minutes. And yeah, can go ahead.
Brief.
Can you hear me? Your hand is up.
I can. Yes, I'll get rid of that next. I'm getting myself unmuted. They're in two different corners. I just wanted to offer a very brief observation on what is something of a parallel phenomenon or related phenomenon. I mean, panic. Right. One of the things you learn in motorsports or in martial arts, and I'm sure a few other related things. One of the things you learn is in an emergency, you don't panic. And this is something that's learned with the training. You don't panic. Because if you panic, you can't pay attention. And if you can't pay attention in these kinds of activities, you'll soon be dead. Right. And that is not an exaggeration. And what you learn with the training and the practice in these kinds of very high stakes, very fast activities is to relax. And you have to relax because you have to be able to pay attention to every last bit of sensory intake you've got in order to anticipate, to monitor what the hell is going on and to respond constructively to whatever happens next. And we're talking tiny milliseconds, and not to overreact. Now, I know that sounds really weird to people that haven't done those kinds of things. But I'm telling you, everybody who's involved in motorsports knows this. Everybody who's involved in martial arts knows this. And it's important. And it's not a matter of suppressing. You really completely retrain your responses so that if the emergency, you can sense it coming, you can anticipate it, and when it happens, you relax. And I can tell you, I'm only here now because I learned how to do that. Right? I was driving motocross before I was street legal. And what I learned racing motocross has saved me on the roads. It has saved my passengers. It has saved people in other vehicles that I did not hit because I knew what I was doing. So I just want to offer this with these concerns about fear or pain or sheer distress, that there can be remarkable kinds of learning, rechanneling, or this remarkable, I think it's a very remarkable phenomenon of just bypassing panic because there's too much to pay attention to.
Yeah, the panic issue is the kind of paradigmatic case for Mark. So I think
Yes.
he wants to talk about it now, so I might let him.
Well, let me just offer one quick footnote, and that is, back when I was in graduate school with the AI people, they were all excited about massive parallel processing. And I'm sorry, they don't know what they're talking about. You want to know about massive parallel processing? Take up dirt bike, right? You have no idea how much information we can take in, recognize, process, and act on. And anybody in motorsports or in martial arts will tell you this, right? When those emergencies happen, it's like suddenly everything's slow motion. I can tell you, nothing is slow motion. It's that we have extra capacity for that kind of intensive information receipt and sorting and responding. And I can tell you, the guys playing around neural nets and massive parallel processing are clueless. End of comment.
I mean, they could potentially achieve the same level of performance with neural networks, but yeah, the claim is that it wouldn't be the same thing as our cognition. But yeah, like we are a long way away from that.
By several orders of magnitude.
Yeah. So Mark, do you want to talk about panic? I could also reiterate that, but.
Yeah, just as panic is an illustration of an aspect of the model of emotion that you alluded to, but it leads me to want to focus a little more explicitly on it. Emotion involves not just this future orientation and anticipation, but notice in anticipating interactions in a certain sense internally with one's own state of uncertainty, one of the things that you will tend to anticipate is forms or presence or absence of resolution of the uncertainty. So if you anticipate resolution of the uncertainty, then you will tend to be motivated in that direction, because it's the resolution that is actually being sought in a certain sense here. It's the resolution that will tend to habituate the variation and selection microgenesis processes. On the other hand, if you anticipate a failure of resolution, and incidentally, you may then have further anticipations based on the anticipation of resolution, because that may involve its own further anticipations, and so on and so on. And the same applies in the negative case. If I anticipate failure of resolution, that may yield an additional kind of uncertainty, which may yield a different orientation into the future. And the sort of pure case of this is panic, where I simply fear the lack of resolution and then fear the product of the fear of the lack of resolution and so on. And I think Ken's put his finger on some aspects of this quite well. I had a therapy client once who would develop panic attacks in a lecture situation, in a lecture hall. And the panic attacks would go roughly like, maybe I'm going to have a panic attack, and I'll have this horrible embarrassment of having to get up and leave because I'm having a panic attack, which of course would make him even more panicky. And there were other issues with this particular guy, but for this particular one, I suggested, well, look, would it be embarrassing if you had to get up and go to the bathroom? And he said, well, no. And I said, well, then why don't you just, get up and go to the bathroom a few times, even if you don't really need to, and develop that as your response to the very beginnings of this panic attack. And that went away. Like I said, there are more issues to deal with, but it was not the uncertainty in the first place. It was the uncertainty built on the fear that the uncertainty wouldn't be resolved, built on the fear that that uncertainty wouldn't be resolved, and so on. Another thing this leads to is emotions about emotions, or not about in the epistemic sense, but emotions that arise from emotions. So this happens with moderate frequency in therapy. I may discover, I may note that I'm extremely angry. And as I look into that anger, Gene Genlin was a guy who really had interesting things to say about this. As I look into that anger, I may discover that I'm angry because you made me afraid. So I'm angry at you for making me afraid. And so there's a fear in a certain sense underneath, although it's not an epistemic underneath. It's a sort of an internal reactive underneath. And those can get enormously complicated. I can get extremely uncomfortable and discover that I'm getting extremely uncomfortable because somebody is actually taking me seriously. And on a fundamental presuppositional level, I assume I'm not a being that should be taken seriously. And that if I presuppose I should be taken seriously, I'm guilty of hubris. And people will maybe be polite enough not to laugh at me, but they would be perfectly justified in laughing at me. I mean, you can get all of these complexities. And this model, I think, handles that reasonably well.
Small footnote about the reactions, learning to relax. That is that when the real emergencies happen, you don't know whether you're going to get through in one piece or maybe two. But what you do know is, if you panic, that's it. That the only prospect for getting through this dangerous situation is not to panic and pay attention to everyone.
I think I made mention a couple of weeks ago another example of something like that. I knew a guy who was extremely world-class good at martial arts. And it sort of illustrates your point in a way. Although he was so far beyond panicking in most circumstances that didn't literally arise. But he walked out of a movie theater into an alley, and some guy was there with a knife to take his money. And this guy knew his response to that was to feel sorry for the guy. And he, quote, took him out, unquote, and hauled him down to the police station. So, you know, I would have panicked probably, but he was not only good at it, he was also very experienced in it, in real world situations, in wartime situations and so on. And panic just didn't occur to him. But you're right, panic, which would have been my response, would have probably been very bad news.
Could I chip in a quick comment question before Busay speaks? Okay. I mean, it just occurred to me. So I was thinking, like, as you get like more expert at some activity, like martial arts, for example, right? Your reflective structures, your reflection over your skills and the anticipations about your level 1 anticipations might be formed before you got expert at it, and therefore you might at the fundamental level be super anticipatorily certain, but it would be kind of expected that there would be some sort of like an inertia period in which you have to realize reflectively that you are no longer a rookie, that now you can actually rely explicitly, reflectively on your skill. And there can be maybe potentially a period in which you are not giving yourself enough credit, so to speak, and therefore generate negative emotions through your reflection over the activity. It's not the activity, your skill at the activity that is generating the emotion, negative emotion, is your actual like reflective anticipation about the skill.
If you're talking about a period early in the training, that can make some sense. right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because the other part that matters so much is that these high stakes, high speed activities all run on extremely well honed skills, right? So that in a sense that I think Mark uses, there's tons of apperceptive awareness of the situation, but there's nothing about subconscious thought, you know, absolutely nothing encoded, no language, no nothing, right? If you started to do any of that, you would lose, right? You can't process the information and yak to yourself about it, right? So that all of these are highly honed skills, and that's it.
Yeah, actually,
So
yeah, just thinking itself might be not welcome, right?
well,
And that might need tuning down.
This is where Mark has his strong suit, and that is, to put it that way, is to presume that the kind of thinking we're having as we're talking with each other is thinking, right? And I think that's false.
I mean, sure, yeah, I've been
And-
using
right.
thinking as to refer to reflection,
Yes.
right? Not thoughts in action, but yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, part of what I'm really quite thrilled about what Mark is doing is that now we have ways of making sense. Mark is giving us ways of making sense out of issues and phenomena that the classic pragmatists really wanted to try to understand, and they didn't have the resources to do it.
Yeah, that's additional thing that Mark doesn't really stress the continuity with pragmatism, but it would be interesting to think about that more, right? Like, because what I take interactivism to be is a kind of like pragmatism on steroids. It's really sophistication of the basic intuition to such a point that now it encompasses much more, right?
And what we have now is articulation and not just intuition. And it's the original pragmatists who were completely naturalistic without being reductionist. We're talking Dewey and James and Peirce, Mead. But Mark has read so much, he doesn't have to have read all of that stuff too.
But I think he did.
Well, perhaps. Mark, leave me a little bit to read, will you please?
As I said, we can only, as is actually the model of ideal within interactivism, that ideals are goals that cannot be achieved but can be pursued. So being bickered is one of them, one of those.
Actually, I would view ideals as asymptotic. And in this case, this is not an asymptotic situation because Mark obviously has reached that point. So if he can do it.
It's ideal for us, right?
Anyone except Mark, yeah. So I'm going to practice my skill of not panicking while asking questions in public. It's not like going to toilet, but similar. So I'm just gonna try to raise my threshold with that. And with what Ken just said, it opened up something for me. That is, I think this panic and fear, the basic two emotions for survival, it just made me think that this is the point where an organism or a system actually starts to develop beyond its capacity as an animal that is being passive and mostly affected through the environment and is trying to engage with the environment from merely the input from the environment and generating something in accordance with that, but moving to the next step of actually creating a context for itself to operate, to generate something from which it can enable itself to be active and working upon the environment, not the other way around. So that just reminded me of the rewiring of the brain. And I think that has some kind of a, I don't know, a reflective sense. And just as a muscle, consciousness also, or self-reflection also can be practiced and further developed. And in that case, I think what panic or fear as a strong core emotion gets differentiated. And by such branching, I would say, of the emotion, this can create further contexts. And this was just making me curious about the process of creativeness or creation. So where an organism gets kind of stuck again due to a panic or due to an uncertainty, an extreme case of uncertainty, it just, how would you say, it turns itself or shifts itself from that point of getting stuck to moving into some kind of a resolving that tension, or creating that, as you said, can the martial arts or motorcycle, like how in that case an organism can actually do that. I mean, I can understand that you have to not panic, but how can you actually shift that gear, right? That's the crucial bit I'm curious about. So
yeah, I think you're right in that the we use reflection to control our emotions, and essentially what you are, I think, referring to is those cases that Mark talked about in terms of therapy, that you can use reflection to get out of panic situations, right? You can control your emotion, you can force yourself internally to meditate in a otherwise really stressful situation, and that can be, you can get into habit of doing that, and therefore you will rewiring your mind so that you are no longer panicking, because you know that you can always use your reflection in such a controlling way. So yeah, like something along these lines, I think is a good point to highlight. Yeah.
Yes. Let me pick that up and also respond a bit to a comment that Georgi has put in the chat, and that is about the training. And it's certainly true that this way of engaging in martial arts or also motor racing shares a lot with some forms of meditation. And it might be that some people can learn that kind of attitude with meditation, but trying to have that preparedness to relax and pay attention to everything instead of panicking, that's a skill that's got to come in the practice, lots of practice in the activity. And you don't start out practicing with black belts, start out with lessons. And this goes back actually to something that Müge was talking about earlier in terms of marking in a dance, right? I mean, part of what you do with practicing is you do parts of routines and practice them. So we say they become automatic. They're not automatic, they're skilled. And as you get more skilled, as you get more skilled at making the maneuvers in martial arts or making the maneuvers on the motorcycle, you can slowly ratchet up the speed and the risk and the degree of your kind of competition. But I don't think it's possible to learn this attitudinal approach independently of the actual activities, because you've got to be able to do it in real time in the actual situation.
That's an interesting point, because that would, if you are wrong and you can actually, through reflection, kind of learn to be okay with anticipatory uncertainty, then there would be kind of two ways of regulating emotion. One is getting skillful and not generating anticipatory uncertainty, and the other one is getting skillful at reflection so that you reflectively internally tune down the anticipatory uncertainty. You kind of are okay with it. Yeah, so you're kind of through reflection, you just assume, I might not be skillful, this might be really dangerous situation, but I don't give a damn anymore, and that,
That won't
I mean,
do
it just
either.
occurred to me this could potentially be a direction.
Well, that might be an option. The skilled practice is much better.
I mean, so, yeah, and certainly more widespread and more effective, I guess, right? Like,
yes. Well, and then, it turns up in odd places, right? I was out hiking in the mountains once and came to a river down in a chasm, and there was indeed the legendary tree trunk right across this chasm. I looked at that, I thought, oh my God, all right. So I undid the belt of my backpack, stood up on the end of this trunk that was across this chasm with the river under, and it was a good ways down. And breathed a couple of times, deeply, relaxed, looked straight across where I was headed, right at my height on the other side of this chasm, and just walked straight across. Just walked straight across. And I'm telling you, the panic doesn't happen. It's not that you have to suppress it. It doesn't happen anymore. Very unusual, which I've been talking about. But yes, it shares a lot with some forms of meditation. And I never was a black belt in martial arts, but I have discussed this with my children's black belt teachers, and they recognize this is exactly what they too are talking about, right? And so you get, the paradoxical phrase, slogan, right? The mind of no mind. Well, it's not mindless. It's that you're focused on what's happening and you've got all of your sensory channels open and you're paying attention. And so, of course, you're not yakking.
That relates to the different approaches to meditation, right? Because mindfulness is one, and the other one is this focus on some really simple routine like breathing and so on. So, so mindfulness might be actually a better way potentially for people who are skillful in the domains. So being mindful of your kind of lived experience does not cause you anxiety because you have a certainty there. But this other route, the more Zen-like, I'd say, we're focusing on some really simple aspect of situation with your reflection might be better for someone who is just not good generally, and therefore you're kind of then, instead of just not being uncertain, you are forcing yourself not to think about it. So something along these lines.
Perhaps. You'll have to ask Mark for advice about that. I've never had.
I mean, I'm brainstorming here right now, so yeah.
In therapy, but from my understanding, the kind of skills and abilities and attitude and so on I'm talking about has much more to do with Zen. Even if it's not as often Zen is reported as being, focusing on simple routines. Don't forget, the samurai also was Zen.
And with that,
samurai warriors in Japan, right? These are the people about whom Kurosawa made all those amazing films. These are the swordsmen who are truly, or were, I mean, they're now gone, but they were amazing. And, that was as, highly trained a martial artist there's ever been. And it was very zen. Because you can't do that stuff without.
I mean, like exegesis of what Zen is and how actually the practices are. Like, I'm not a specialist on that, but I read a few books on meditation, and they seem to be stressing the difference between mindfulness and this kind of focusing on the routine. Yeah.
So if I can just further clarify my point a bit, I can understand the meditation and practicing and how that actually makes that organism or the system get acquainted with the stress that actually one is putting oneself in, so that it gets familiar with what's going on, so that it raises the threshold of the stress, so that it actually can manage in that situation and can start to think the alternatives to how to go beyond that stress and actually do something and be calm and pay attention. But what I was actually curious about more is how one can put oneself into that stress, which actually is kind of irrational in the sense of survival, because it certainly tries to avoid that stress. And it must have something, some kind of a reward situation or some kind of different anticipation, so that it puts into that stress in order to learn something. And that's what I was curious about, kind of.
Well, I'll give you 3 different reference points, or 2 of them heard, but these kinds of high-speed, high-stakes sports are really exciting. Started a different end, where I in fact started before I was in motocross. I was much younger. I was a figure skater.
The stories that people have.
Yes, I know. And this is one of those situations where students find out about some of their teachers. But yes, I was a figure skater when I was quite young. And it's fabulous. It's as close as you can get to flying without leaving the surface of the earth. And I'm sure that a lot of the skills I learned then, moving in, I mean, you spend a whole lot of time going backwards and circling, and you have to know where you are on the ice, or you might jump over the boards at the perimeter, which is a really bad idea. I never did, but it wouldn't have been too hard. And you learn a lot about how to keep track of literally your location and your trajectory and literally your own attitude, right? How you are poised on the ice, and how to time, and how not to start a maneuver too soon. I'm sure all of that is part of what kept me from ever injuring myself ever after, including when I took a later.
Okay, so should we begin? We have